Hey guys, tonight we're stepping inside the world of the medieval plague rat. You're about to find out why this life might look like endless feasts and cozy dark corners, until we explore why you're also the itchy, twitchy villain blamed for one of the deadliest pandemics in history. If you're enjoying our sleepy history dives, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know. And I'm always curious where you're listening from, so drop a comment with your city and the time it is there. I love seeing our sleepy little global community connect. Now settle in, dim the lights, maybe let a candle flicker nearby, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Because you'll soon find out why you'd need a lawyer as a plague rat in the 15th century. You scurry across cobblestones slick with slop. To you it is paradise. To humans it is pestilence. Every morning in a medieval city is a gift basket of refuse. Buckets of urine and excrement hurled from upstairs windows, half-chewed meat bones tossed into the street, and puddles of spoiled ale running downhill. The town smells like a latrine married a brewery and then rotted in the sun. For humans, this is misery. For you, it is a buffet. People in the Middle Ages did not think much about sanitation the way later societies would. Cities like London or Paris had no proper sewage systems in the 14th century. Instead, there were open gutters, called kennels, running down the middle of streets. Everything ended up there. When it rained, the waste moved sluggishly, forming pools thick with grease. To a rat, this was not a problem, but a feature. A soggy crust of bread floating in a gutter is a floating banquet. You drag it out, nibble the edges, and feel triumphant. Archaeologists have found that medieval trash layers are treasure troves for understanding daily life. Broken pottery, animal bones, fish scales, charred bread, and nutshells piled up in midden heaps. For you it means variety. You chew through oyster shells discarded by the wealthy, gnaw marrow from beef bones stripped at a feast, and nestle inside heaps of straw soaked in ale. The humans thought they were throwing away garbage. You thought they were setting the table. The texture of this world is constant stimulation. Every surface is something to gnaw. Your teeth never stop growing, and so they must never stop filing down. You grind against wood, gnash through rope, and even test your jaws against lead pipes. Rats have been known to chew through softer metals, leaving historians puzzled when ancient water conduits collapsed. You're not aware of the science, only the satisfaction of that crunch. The sounds of your city are equally vivid. The creak of a cartwheel, the splash of a chamber pot hitting cobblestones, the distant wail of a church bell tolling another funeral. At night there is the crackle of torches as watchmen stomp down alleys, their boots squelching in the filth you call supper. Their disgust is your safety. Nobody wants to step closer to a pile that stinks so badly, so you thrive. And here is where the history sharpens its irony. Humans often blamed famine and poor harvest for their hunger, yet their waste tells another story. Even in times of scarcity, you find grains spilling from cracked sacks in storehouses, or bread going stale faster than it could be eaten. Rats are opportunistic. The Black Death itself followed trade routes because of this abundance. Grain ships travelling from Asia to Europe carried more than food. They carried you and your fleas, tucked away in the shadows of cargo holds. A single sack of millet was a Trojan horse of plague. The stench of fish is another part of your world. Medieval Europeans consumed vast quantities of herring, particularly during fasting seasons when meat was forbidden. Salted fish filled markets from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. When it spoiled, you feasted. Archaeological digs at medieval harbours reveal layers of discarded fish bones, scales, and even entire spoiled catches. You nestle into the piles, stomach churning happily, fur reeking of brine. To you this is survival. To historians centuries later it is evidence of how intertwined human diets and your colonies were. There is no shortage of material for nests either. Shredded linen, wool scraps and straw line every corner of a tanner's workshop or a baker's storehouse. You carry these fibres piece by piece to dark rafters or burrows beneath floorboards. Medieval records even mention officials trying to regulate waste disposal, with mixed success. In London, ordinances were passed to prevent dumping animal entrails in the Thames, yet accounts complain the river continued to stink. Where regulation failed, your colony flourished. Every bite you take leaves a mark. The gnawing of rats has been preserved in history itself. Manuscripts in monasteries sometimes show teeth marks where vellum was nibbled. Wooden chests excavated from plague pits show chewed corners. Even armour stored away for years was sometimes found pocked with tiny rodent impressions. You are the graffiti artist of filth, signing your presence across centuries. And while you enjoy this chaos, your fleas are enjoying you. These parasites thrive because garbage heaps attract not only rats, but also stray cats, dogs, and livestock. Fleas do not discriminate. They leap from you to them and back again, forming a chain of pestilence. This is where Yersinia pestis found its perfect highway. Warm-blooded hosts, crowded conditions, and endless filth formed a microbial utopia. The result was a pandemic that reshaped Europe. But for you, it was just another Tuesday scratching your side against a barrel. The deeper absurdity is that the humans almost encouraged your presence. Barns were constructed with gaps and cracks. Market stalls overflowed with grain. Food storage was primitive at best. Even monasteries with their vows of poverty stored large amounts of wine and bread that inevitably attracted you. And when famine struck, humans often abandoned storage sites, leaving behind caches you eagerly devoured. Their suffering was your gain. The air is thick with flies, another competitor in the waste economy. They buzz, land, and scatter, but unlike them, you can hoard. You carry chunks back to your nests, feeding pups with morsels of offal. The life expectancy of a rat may be short, often a year or two, but reproduction keeps the cycle turning. Medieval chronicles describe cities so overrun with vermin that rat catchers became a profession. Yet their efforts were laughable against the tide of litters replacing every rat killed. Your life on medieval garbage is not glamorous. It is itchy, greasy, pungent, and ceaselessly noisy. But it is effective. This environment is why you spread with such relentless success. You're not simply a nuisance on the edges of medieval life. You're embedded in it, woven through every alley, every midden heap, every damp cellar. And from these heaps of rot, your journey will carry you further. You will not only infest homes and markets, you will sail on ships, spread across continents, and slip into the very architecture of empires. But before that, you will discover that even garbage has hierarchies, and that sometimes the best scraps come from monasteries and kitchens that were never meant for you at all. Your fur twitches and crawls with movement that is not your own. You're never alone, not for a single heartbeat. Fleas ride you like professional jockeys clinging to a hairy horse. Each bite leaves a red welt. Each leap carries the potential to change the course of human history. You scratch, gnaw, and roll against rough wood to shake them loose, but they always return. Hundreds of tiny passengers burrowing into your coat like a mobile blood market. A flea can jump up to 200 times its body length, the medieval equivalent of a human leaping over a cathedral. This absurd athleticism made them almost impossible to avoid. Your fur is their city, your bloodstream their tavern. They pierce your skin with needle-like mouth parts, siphoning blood with the persistence of a tax collector. For you, it is irritating. For humanity, it was catastrophic. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the Black Death, thrived inside the digestive tract of fleas. When the flea bit into a host, bacteria blocked its gut, making it vomit infected material back into the wound. That grotesque hiccup spread the disease more efficiently than any rat bite ever could. You were the bus, but the fleas were the assassins. Yet in the minds of medieval humans, it was easier to blame the scurrying silhouette than the speck too small to see. The sensation of living with fleas is constant agitation. You gnaw at your own skin, scratch against walls, and sometimes bite each other in frustration. Medieval humans noticed the same thing. Chroniclers described how vermin scratched themselves incessantly. which only reinforced the superstition that rats were diseased in their very nature. The truth was more complicated. Fleas could jump between rats, dogs, cats, and humans indiscriminately. Crowded conditions in medieval cities meant everyone was part of the same flea circus. Doctors at the time attempted to make sense of the outbreaks with the tools of humoral theory. They believed the body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was caused by imbalance. Flea bites, festering buboes, and high fevers were interpreted as signs of corrupted air or divine punishment. Physicians wore long robes, carried posies of herbs to sniff, and sometimes applied strange remedies like pressing onions or pigeons onto swollen lymph nodes. None of it worked because none of it addressed the flea. You never think about any of this. Your focus is on food and warmth. The fleas thrive because you thrive. Grain sacks and storehouses are warm nests, not only for rats but also for the fleas you carry. Fleas do not need humans to survive. They only need blood. Every rat burrow, every pile of straw, every woven mat is another flea nursery. And while you scratch, the fleas breed. A female flea can lay up to 50 eggs a day, which roll off into bedding or fur, hatching into larvae that squirm through dust and debris. By the time humans sweep out a chamber, the cycle has already begun again. The irony is that medieval humans were not entirely blind to parasites. They regularly fought lice, which infested hair, clothing, and bedding. Combs from archaeological digs in York and Lubeck show the telltale remains of head lice and their eggs. People wrote complaints about the itching, scratched their scalps raw, and even believed lice were a natural part of life. One chronicler suggested that lice were proof of original sin, crawling reminders of humanity's fall from grace. Fleas were lumped into the same miserable category, their bites explained as punishment rather than biology. The soundscape of fleas is silence, but the soundscape of their aftermath is not. Coughs, moans, wheezes, the hollow toll of church bells announcing yet another plague victim. In the 14th century Europe, entire communities fell silent except for those bells, punctuating the air like a grim metronome. You sit in a rafter's nest above a coughing household, scratching your side as a flea hops from your fur onto the blanket below. That leap is not simply irritation, it is a vector that will topple half a family tree. Historians debate how much blame belongs to you, and how much to your passengers. Some studies suggest that human fleas and lice may have played an even larger role than rat fleas in spreading plague. Clothing, crowded beds, and shared homes form the perfect transmission lines. Yet even centuries later, the popular image remains the same. Rat equals plague. Flea equals afterthought. Your public relations problem has been eternal. Medieval art even depicted scenes of vermin, though often allegorically. Rats and fleas symbolize sin, gluttony, or the devil himself. In some marginalia, fleas were drawn as monstrous biting creatures, their tiny scale exaggerated into nightmare caricatures. Ironically, the humans were not far off. The flea is one of the most efficient disease transmitters in history. Its partnership with you reshaped demography, economies, and religious life. Entire villages vanished, labour shortages destabilised feudal systems, and wages rose for survivors. A tiny insect with a needle mouth and a stubborn appetite did more to alter society than many kings. Still, from your perspective, it is only scratching. You hunch on a beam, gnawing a kernel of grain, twitching your tail. The fleas crawl through your fur, and you bite at your own flank with a squeak. Down below, a physician sprinkles vinegar on a swollen patient, convinced the stench will drive out bad air. Neither of you understand what is really happening. But centuries later, historians would point at this silent partnership, the rat and the flea, as the engine of one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. And it is not only disease that makes fleas significant, they are the reason humans feared filth itself. Cleanliness became linked with morality, not just hygiene. If fleas thrived in dirty straw and foul air, then purity was both spiritual and practical. Bathhouses, already common in medieval towns, took on new importance, though ironically many were abandoned during plague outbreaks for fear of contagion. That cycle of washing and avoiding washing reflected humanity's attempt to outsmart an insect that weighed less than a grain of rice. Your life continues as the host of this circus, itching, twitching, scratching. Your fleas are fed, your colony thrives, and humanity suffers. But the story of your existence does not stop here. Fleas may be your most infamous companions, yet they are not the only creatures entangled with your history. As you move from rafters to granaries to ships, you will find yourself locked in a constant rivalry with another opportunist, a creature humans both adore and despise. The cat waits in the shadows, eyes gleaming, whiskers twitching, and where there are rats, there are always cats. The eyes glint first, pale lanterns in the dark. You freeze, whiskers twitching, because you know the shape that follows. The cat is your oldest adversary, the only predator humans willingly keep inside their homes, not for meat or companionship alone, but for you. Wherever your colony thrives, the cat is not far behind. You gnaw rope, they gnaw you. It is a relationship written into the architecture of medieval life. In Egyptian temples, cats were worshipped, embalmed, and honoured with their own burials. By the Middle Ages, their reputation had shifted. They were no longer gods but guardians. Barn cats, kitchen cats, monastery cats, all kept for their ability to stalk and pounce. Their sharp claws were the medieval equivalent of rat traps, cheap, renewable, and always hungry. Cats made their way onto ships as well, prowling cargo holds stacked with grain. Maritime records mention ship's cats not as mascots, but as essential crew, their purpose clear. Without them, rats like you could chew through ropes, sails, and food supplies long before a voyage ended. Yet cats were not always trusted. Superstition tangled with their usefulness. In parts of medieval Europe, cats were associated with witchcraft, the devil, or ill omens. Some were even culled in misguided attempts to ward off evil. The irony is painful. Reducing cat populations meant rat populations exploded. During outbreaks of plague, this created perfect conditions for disease to spread further. Human fear of sorcery amplified your advantage. The fewer cats in a town, the safer your burrows became. Archaeological evidence reveals this uneasy balance. Bones of both cats and rats are often found together in medieval middens, a silent record of conflict. Some cat bones show injuries consistent with hunting, while rat bones display gnaw marks suggesting desperate escapes. Written records describe rats running along rafters, while cats patrolled floors, an endless vertical chase. Neither side won completely. You reproduce too quickly, they stalk too patiently. The war is eternal and endlessly renewed, with each litter born on both sides. You feel the pressure in every movement. Cats force you to evolve behaviours, you scuttle close to walls, avoid open spaces, and emerge mostly at night. This is why humans came to associate you with darkness and shadows. Your nocturnal habits are not mystical. They are a survival tactic against feline hunters. A cat's vision in low light is 6 times stronger than that of a human. To you, this is a curse. To them, it is an advantage honed by centuries of ambush. And while the humans believed cats were simply guardians of their grain, the truth was more complicated. Cats, like you, lived symbiotically with human settlements. They fed on scraps, nested in barns, and thrived in households. In many towns, the line between tolerated guest and household member blurred. Cats kept humans entertained while also protecting them from infestations. You became the villain of the tale, cats the hero. Though both of you were opportunists, religious institutions added another layer of absurdity. Monks wrote of cats chasing vermin in scriptoriums, their presence tolerated because they preserved manuscripts from being gnawed. Some manuscripts even contained doodles of cats, paw prints across vellum where a wandering animal tracked ink with its feet. You were also there, teeth marks biting into bindings, droppings left in margins. The eternal battle was etched into the very pages of medieval history. Still, cats were not flawless exterminators. They preferred young or sickly rats, leaving stronger ones to reproduce. They also ate birds, rabbits, and anything small enough to catch. Humans often misunderstood this balance. A town overrun with rats might kill cats in frustration, not realizing they were cutting down their own defense system. When plague swept Europe, many communities slaughtered cats out of fear that they were demonic agents. The result was a surge in rat populations, feeding the very epidemic they feared. Superstition handed you victory more than once. The sensory side of this war is constant tension. The soft pad of paws on straw, the sudden silence that falls when a cat enters a granary, the prickling of your whiskers as you hug a beam above. The smell of fur, sharper and cleaner than your own greasy coat, triggers alarm. Even your pups learn early to distinguish it. A squeak from one of them can draw claws in an instant. You live with the sound of hissing and the scrape of nails against wood. It is not peace. It is a long, grinding stalemate. Maritime history magnifies this conflict. Ships leaving ports like Genoa, Venice and Bristol carried both rats and cats across oceans. You gnawed through grain barrels while cats patrolled decks. Logs from sailors mentioned both creatures frequently, sometimes humorously. A well-fed ship's cat was prized, even protected, because losing one meant nights of scratching noises from below deck and chewed ropes by morning. You were an uninvited passenger. They were the invited enforcer, and yet you both travelled the world side by side. Your story cannot be told without theirs. Without cats, you might have overrun medieval Europe completely, chewing through foundations and granaries unchecked. Without rats, cats might have never embedded so deeply in human households. Together you shaped human settlement, their fears, their superstitions, and their architecture. It was not just a war, it was an arms race, one that made humans the beneficiaries and the victims depending on their choices. And while you hunch in a corner, whiskers twitching, the cat waits silently, eyes fixed, claws flexing. This predator has been placed in homes, monasteries, ships, and farms for one reason: to hunt you. The fact that you are still here, scratching and gnawing, proves only that the war never ends. Cats catch you, but never all of you. They reduce numbers, but never erase them. You thrive in the gaps, in the shadows, in the moments when superstition makes humans fear their own guardians. The absurdity lies in the balance. Medieval people blamed you for plague, feared you for your numbers, and tolerated cats for their hunting. Yet in trying to manage both, they often created conditions worse than before. Fewer cats meant more rats meant more fleas meant more plague. The cycle turned endlessly, scratching its way through history, and as you continue to scuttle along beams and gutters, always aware of the silent watcher with sharpened claws, you find that your greatest danger is not feline at all. For there is another enemy lurking, one armed not with teeth or claws but with human ingenuity. It scratches not at your fur but at your very survival, a trap baited with food and designed with cruel precision. The war with cats is eternal, but the invention of rat traps brought a new battlefield entirely. The cat crouches in the corner, but the human grows impatient. Claws and whiskers are not enough. You have gnawed too many grain sacks, darted across too many rafters, spread too many fleas. So the human does what humans always do when threatened. They invent. The war against you moves from paw to mechanism. Early rat traps were simple but cruel. Pits dug into floors, baited with scraps, covered by thin boards. You scuttle across, the board snaps, and you tumble into a writhing pit of your own kin. There you claw and squeak, but escape is rare. Archaeologists excavating medieval homes have found small subterranean chambers filled with gnawed bones, silent testaments to these traps. Humans had turned basements into miniature battlefields. Metalwork advanced the war. By the late Middle Ages, blacksmiths fashioned spring devices designed to snap shut on your neck or body. They were heavy, clumsy, but devastating when triggered. Records from the 16th century describe merchants purchasing such traps in bulk to protect cargo. Imagine that, an entire industry dedicated to making sure you never touched a loaf of bread. Even your teeth marks in wood inspired technological progress. But the traps were not only mechanical, humans weaponized food against you. Poisoned baits laced with arsenic or later strychnine were deployed in granaries. Arsenic was common in the medieval world, used in pigments and medicines, so its transition into rat control was natural. To you it tasted no different than flour or meat, but it burned your insides. Ironically, the humans poisoning you often poisoned themselves. In households where food and rat bait sat side by side, mix-ups were inevitable. Historical records include cases of entire families sickened after confusing laced grain with dinner supplies. The profession of rat catcher emerged from this ongoing war. Men, sometimes accompanied by trained dogs or ferrets, roamed towns hunting your colonies. They were paid per tail or per carcass. In some towns, like Augsburg in the 15th century, rat catchers were municipal employees, their work as official as a baker or blacksmith. Chroniclers sometimes mocked them, describing them as part magician, part fraud, since no one could truly rid a city of you. You reproduced faster than their contracts could be renewed. Superstition added even stranger tools to the arsenal. In some regions, rats were taken to court. Medieval law occasionally treated vermin as moral offenders, guilty of trespass or theft. There are actual legal records of rats being excommunicated by priests or summoned before church councils. Of course, you never attended, but the ritual of blaming you in public allowed communities to feel they had done something against the unseen plague. One bizarre example from Autumn, France in the early 16th century involved church officials hiring a lawyer to defend rats accused of eating grain. The lawyer argued they could not attend court safely because of cats. Absurd theatre, yet very real. The sensory world of these traps is violence in miniature. The snap of a spring in the night, the shriek of a captured rat echoing through timbered halls, the scrape of a broom sweeping up bodies in the morning. To humans, these sounds meant relief. To you, they were warnings carried through colonies, as if the walls themselves were speaking of death. Yet even then, you adapted. Rats are neophobic, suspicious of new objects. If one of your kin dies in a trap, you sniff carefully and avoid it. Humans often cursed your intelligence, baffled that bait went untouched. The larger irony is that rat traps never eliminated you, they only reshaped your behaviour. Traps culled the curious and left behind the cautious. Over centuries, this selective pressure made your species even warier, faster, harder to fool. Every failed trap was a lesson carved into rat memory. Humans bragged about progress, but in reality they were training you to outwit them. Art and literature occasionally reflected these battles. Marginalia in medieval manuscripts showed doodles of rats chased by cats, sometimes even by men wielding sticks. Woodcuts from later centuries depict elaborate traps, almost comical in design, like miniature fortresses armed against whiskers and tails. These images reveal not only fear but fascination. You were not just vermin, you were entertainment, puzzles for engineers and props for moral lessons. Meanwhile, communities experimented with collective hunts. Villagers banged pots, lit fires, and drove rats toward rivers or fields. These rat drives were noisy festivals of desperation, half civic duty, half carnival. Chronicles mention thousands of rats flushed out of towns during such events, though of course within weeks your numbers returned. The humans treated it like a holiday. You treated it like a minor inconvenience. On ships, the war continued. Traps were set in holds, sometimes baited with salted meat. Cats prowled decks while sailors checked snares. Yet still you thrived. Rats could chew through barrels, swim through bilge water, and reproduce mid-voyage. Ships returning from the east often arrived with fewer sailors than rats. The irony was grotesque. Humans attempted to trap you to save themselves, but the very act of trapping confirmed how vital you were to their story. The smell of poison, the clang of springs, the squeal of captured kin all become part of your world. Yet despite centuries of ingenuity, the traps never changed the outcome. You multiplied faster than they killed. You adapted quicker than they designed. Humans thought they were winning battles. You were winning the war simply by continuing to exist. And while traps rattled in the rafters and poison seeped into bread, another battlefield was opening that you could not gnaw your way out of. For humans were building not just traps, but cities themselves in ways that either doomed or sheltered you. Architecture, sanitation, and the rise of urban planning would shape your fate as much as claws or springs ever did. You slip through cracks that were never meant to exist. The walls of a medieval house are your highways, timber beams stacked with gaps just wide enough for your body to squeeze through. Humans call it bad construction. You call it opportunity. Architecture has always been your greatest ally. Every choice they make in building their world creates another entrance into yours. The medieval home is porous. Wattle and daub walls crumble easily under your teeth. That mixture of sticks, clay and straw may hold up against wind, but not against incisors sharpened by centuries of gnawing. You chew holes that become permanent doorways. Archaeologists have found rat-sized tunnels in preserved medieval walls, clear evidence that you were tenants as much as the humans who slept inside. In these cavities you nest, your squeaks echoing faintly through plaster, your smell woven into the fibres. Timber framing is worse. Gaps between beams are open invitations. You scurry along rafters, dropping pellets that clatter onto tables below. Monasteries suffered constantly from this design. Imagine monks copying sacred texts while you patter overhead, scratching and gnawing. The manuscripts they laboured over bear your signature in tiny bites at the edges. In some abbeys, the architecture funneled warmth from kitchens directly into roof beams, creating cosy winter burrows. You became uninvited residents in holy houses, an absurd companion to prayer and silence. Then there are the bridges. Medieval bridges often doubled as marketplaces, with stalls and houses built directly on them. London Bridge was infamous for this. Beneath the planks, between the supports, you thrived. The rushing river below provided water, discarded scraps from above provided food, and the stonework gave shelter. Travellers crossing the bridge never thought about the colonies twitching in the shadows beneath their feet. Your empire extended from roof beams to riverbanks without interruption. Sewers, or the medieval attempt at them, were another perfect habitat. London and Paris experimented with stone-lined drains, often connecting directly to rivers. These channels carried human waste, animal offal, and kitchen refuse. You followed the flow like a labyrinth, darting in and out of grates, feeding on the endless slurry. Historians examining these drains have found layers of organic matter riddled with gnaw marks. You were there, moving unseen under the city like whiskered shadows of the underworld. Plague pits became your banquet halls. During the Black Death, mass graves were dug hastily on the edges of towns. Corpses stacked together created not only disease but food. Clothing, boots, and flesh all became part of your menu. Excavations of plague pits show rodent bones scattered among human remains, a sign that your colonies had turned graveyards into feasting grounds. The humans prayed for deliverance above, while below you multiplied in silence. It is grotesque, but for you it was simply survival. Castles and fortresses, meant to keep enemies out, did little to keep you in check. Storerooms stacked with grain, pantries filled with salted meats, wine cellars dripping with barrels. Thick stone walls protected humans from invaders, but offered you uninterrupted feasting. Even royal courts complained about rats spoiling banquets. In the 14th century France, records describe infestations so severe that officials attempted to hire exterminators for palaces. You were not limited by social class. The same rat could chew bread in a peasant hut one night and scuttle across a king's kitchen floor the next. Your sensory world is shaped by this architecture. The damp chill of stone basements, the rough splinters of timber beams, the warm hay of thatched roofs. Every texture is a shelter. Every crevice is a corridor. Humans never designed with you in mind, yet every design sheltered you anyway. When they built higher, you climbed. When they dug lower, you followed. When they sealed doors, you gnawed through walls. You were not pests on the edges of architecture. You were part of it. Ironically, attempts to improve buildings often helped you. When London required homes to be tiled instead of thatched to prevent fires, rats simply moved into sturdier roofs. When monasteries stored grain in larger barns, you enjoyed feasts on a grander scale. When towns fortified their sewers, you inherited stronger tunnels. Human progress was your infrastructure plan. Historians see you everywhere in the record. Rat bones found in cesspits confirm how deeply embedded you were. Shoe marks and wooden beams are timestamps of your presence. Even church complaints reveal your success. Priests warned congregations about vermin as symbols of sin, yet their sermons echoed in halls that you already occupied. Architecture made you permanent. A hole in a wall is not just a passage, but a history lesson. Every cathedral, every tavern, every bridge was built with cracks wide enough for your whiskers. You were not only living on garbage and dodging traps, you were moving into the very skeleton of cities, an empire of timber and stone that guaranteed you were never more than a few inches away from human life. And as buildings grew, so did ships. The architecture of wood and rope that carried men across oceans carried you as well. The grain stores of caravels and cogs, the beams of galleons, the hidden corners of bilge water, all became extensions of your world. You were not only local, you were global. The human desire to explore was also your invitation to invade. The beam of the house becomes the beam of a ship. Wood is wood, rope is rope, and grain is grain, whether nailed into a cottage wall or lashed into the hull of a merchant vessel. You slip aboard unnoticed, whiskers twitching, paws damp from bilge water. Without intending it, humans have made you a global traveller. Their ships are your carriages, their voyages your migrations. Medieval ships were floating banquets for your kind. Grain, salted meat, dried peas, and hardtack-filled barrels stacked high in the hold. To sailors it was survival food. To you it was endless variety. Gnaw marks on timbers from wrecks like the Mary Rose, a Tudor warship, show that rats nested deep inside the vessel long before it sank. You dined in the dark while sailors staggered above deck, never knowing how many whiskered shadows shared their voyage. The bilge was your second home. That stagnant pool of seawater collecting at the bottom of every ship reeked of rot, oil, and fish. Humans hated it. You thrived in it. In those damp shadows you found moisture, insects, and shelter from prowling cats. Archaeologists studying wrecks often discover rat bones in bilge layers, proof that your colonies nested in the filthiest part of the vessel. Sailors cursed the smell. You simply twitched your nose and went back to chewing. Your fleas travelled with you. When Genoese ships docked in Messina in 1347, they carried not only silk and spice, but plague. From one port, the infection spread rapidly across Europe. Chroniclers describe towns struck suddenly, with entire households dead within days. You were blamed as the courier of death, though again the fleas did the biting. Still, the image of the rat leaping from ship to shore, a squeaking emissary of doom, burned itself into memory. Trade routes became plague routes, and you were the ticket collector. Ship's cats were a constant obstacle. Sailors valued them as much as sails and ropes. Cats hunted you relentlessly, padding silently through the hold at night. Yet you reproduced too quickly to be stopped. Cats could kill dozens. You birthed hundreds. Sailors often reported hearing squeaks and scurries despite keeping cats aboard, proof that the balance always tilted in your favour. The sensory world of the ship was endless noise. The groan of wood bending against waves, the snap of sails, the shouts of sailors, the creak of ropes. To you it was background music. You darted between barrels, your claws scratching faint rhythms against planks. At night, when men snored in hammocks, you squealed and gnawed, the true orchestra of the voyage. History remembers you not only as a nuisance, but as a destroyer. Ship's logs complain of spoiled food, chewed sails, and weakened ropes. A single rat colony could ruin provisions meant to last months. Salted pork gnawed at the edges, sacks of grain leaking trails across the deck, even leather waterskins punctured by teeth. You were not just passengers, you were saboteurs. Ironically, sailors sometimes welcomed your presence. To see rats abandoning a ship was considered an omen of sinking. The phrase still lingers centuries later. Sailors watched for your movements, treating you as barometers of disaster. If you fled, they panicked. Your twitching whiskers became portents, your scurrying feet predictions. You were both pest and prophet, despised yet heeded. As ships grew larger, your empire expanded. The age of exploration carried you to new continents. You disembarked in the Americas, Australia, and countless islands. Wherever humans planted flags, rats slipped ashore. Polynesian islands, once devoid of you, were soon infested, native birds and plants devastated. You were not only a European problem, but a global phenomenon. Historians call you an invasive species. You simply followed the grain. Even naval warfare bore your mark. Blockaded ships often reported infestations worsening as supplies dwindled. Hungry rats gnawed anything edible, including leather boots and rigging soaked in animal fat. Desperate sailors set traps, but hunger drove rats to boldness. Accounts exist of rats running openly across decks in daylight during sieges, as if mocking the men who could not leave. Your audacity grew with their desperation. The smell of tar and salt fused with the stink of rat droppings in every voyage. Your colonies left trails that no cleaning could erase. Sailors knew you were there, even if they never saw you. The scratching at night was enough. You became part of maritime folklore, a creature as inevitable as storms and pirates. Rats were listed among the dangers of sea travel, alongside scurvy and mutiny. You were not just vermin. You were sailors too, albeit uninvited and unpaid. And so from one ship to another, you leapt continents, reshaped ecosystems, and rode the ambitions of explorers. Wherever the tide took them, it took you. From rafters to bilges, from Europe to Asia to the New World, you gnawed your way into global history. But the sea was not your only stage. As ships docked, markets bustled and plague bells tolled, another war was unfolding on land. Not with cats or traps this time, but with the very people who tried to outthink you. Doctors, philosophers, and chroniclers all debated your existence, drawing bizarre conclusions about what you were and what you meant. Their explanations were as strange as the scratching noises in their rafters, and their attempts to describe you were often funnier than any gnawing you ever did. You never asked to be a metaphor, yet humans cannot help themselves. They see whiskers and twitching tails and immediately reach for meaning. In their eyes, you're never only an animal, you are sin, hunger, gluttony, greed, betrayal, or sometimes all of these packed into one squeaking silhouette. Your presence in their imagination is almost as pervasive as your presence in their walls. Medieval theologians often linked you to moral decay. Rats crawling through grain were equated with temptation gnawing at the soul. A friar might preach about the devil's work by pointing to a sack shredded by your teeth. The symbolism was obvious to them. You eat in secret, you move in shadows, you spread unseen destruction. This made you a perfect villain for sermons. The congregation shuddered, but you still scuttled across rafters above their heads, indifferent to allegory. In manuscripts you appear at the margins. Illuminated texts filled with saints and angels sometimes carry small doodles of rats, chewing parchment or scurrying near demons. These were not idle scribbles, but warnings. To the medieval imagination, you were living footnotes of corruption. In one French bestiary, rats were described as corrupters of stores, who gnawed not only grain but also virtue. The comparison was not flattering, yet it confirmed your role as a permanent cultural irritant. Medical texts also dragged you into their pages. While fleas carried plague, physicians often described rats as disease themselves, corrupted by miasma, or bad air, and embodying contagion. Some doctors insisted that the presence of rats signalled poisoned environments. They were not entirely wrong, though for the wrong reasons. Where waste piled up, rats thrived. Where rats thrived, fleas spread disease. In blaming you, they stumbled toward truth without ever reaching it. The absurdity of medieval medicine shines in treatments for rat-related plague. Physicians recommended fumigating homes with herbs like rosemary and sage, or even burning sulphur to drive rats out. The smell was unbearable, choking the lungs of everyone present, but the rats usually stayed put. Other remedies suggested sleeping with onions or carrying talismans shaped like cats. None of it worked, but each attempt added to the growing mythology of your menace. Philosophers occasionally reached for you in their metaphors too. Rats became examples of unchecked appetite, chewing endlessly as a warning against gluttony. In some moral treatises, the gnawing of rats was compared to the way sin consumes a man from within. Even when philosophers tried to sound serious, they turned you into props for their lectures. You became symbols of everything humans feared about themselves: hungry, restless, unclean, unstoppable. The sensory reality did not help your case. Your scratching in the walls at night sounded like whispers of evil. Your squeaks were shrill, unnerving. The smell of droppings confirmed suspicions of corruption. Every sense reinforced the idea that you were not just an animal, but a sign. Historians argue that this sensory assault shaped much of the cultural imagery around you. Rats were not only visible, they were audible and olfactory, inescapable even in darkness. Even legal codes reveal the depth of this symbolism. Some towns issued ordinances demanding houses be rat-free or face penalties. Of course, compliance was impossible, but the laws themselves elevated you from nuisance to civic enemy. A rat infestation was not only unhygienic, but also criminal. The absurdity of fining people for failing to prevent the unpreventable shows how much fear you inspired. Folk traditions added yet another layer. In rural Europe, rats were sometimes thought to carry souls, or to be omens of death when they appeared in unusual places. Stories circulated of rats leaving a house before fire or disaster, reinforcing the idea that you were tied to fate itself. This superstition travelled well. Sailors repeated it, townsfolk believed it, and your movements became weather vanes for misfortune. Historians studying marginalia, sermons, and ordinances see a pattern. Rats were never allowed to just be rats. You were elevated into cautionary tales, walking metaphors, and embodied anxieties. While cats were sometimes treated with affection, you were always cast as the reminder of decay. Even when plague was not present, your image carried plague with it, an invisible baggage of association. And still you thrived. Sermons could preach, laws could ban, philosophers could moralize, but none of it changed the scratching in the beams above. Your colonies multiplied behind the words written against you. Manuscripts condemning rats often bear the literal teeth marks of rats, as if you were mocking the scribes by chewing the very pages of their warnings. A rat's rebuttal, silent but permanent. Your place in human imagination became so fixed that centuries later you remained shorthand for corruption. Political cartoons in later eras depict enemies as rats. Literature uses you as symbols of decay or treachery. The Middle Ages cemented the association. You became permanent fixtures in the human psyche, as lasting as church bells or cathedral spires. Yet behind all the metaphor and superstition lies the ordinary truth. You were not plotting sin, only seeking food. You were not evil, only hungry. But the fact that humans projected so much meaning onto you reveals more about them than you. In their desperation to explain disease and decay, they needed a villain. You were convenient, plentiful, and already squeaking in the rafters. The imagination of man turned you into a walking allegory. But imagination does not stop at sermons and symbols. It also spills into ritual, into exorcisms, into community spectacles meant to rid towns of your presence. And that is where the story carries you next. From metaphor to ceremony, from scribbled margins to public theatre, you will find yourself standing trial in ways no animal should, caught in the absurd rituals of medieval superstition. You never imagined you would need a lawyer, yet in the strange theatre of medieval Europe, you found yourself summoned before judges and priests. Humans were not satisfied with traps, poisons, and cats. They wanted formality, ritual, and legal closure. If rats ruined grain, they were to be tried for theft. If rats infested towns, they were to be excommunicated like heretics. It was justice as farce, but deadly serious to those performing it. Court cases against rats are recorded in France, Switzerland, and Italy between the 14th and 16th centuries. These were not private jokes. They were official proceedings, complete with documents, clerks, and arguments. In one famous case in autumn France, rats accused of devouring barley were summoned to appear before the ecclesiastical court. The animals, of course, failed to attend. A lawyer appointed in their defence argued that travel was unsafe because of cats. The court adjourned, as if whiskers and tails had filed for a continuance. The absurdity deepened when judges ordered repeated summons. Heralds went into streets announcing the court's demands, calling for rats to appear at set times. When they didn't arrive, penalties were pronounced, often curses or excommunications. The spectacle was not about actual punishment. It was about control. Communities wanted to symbolically confront the chaos gnawing at their lives. By putting rats on trial, they reassured themselves that justice still functioned, even if the accused never squeaked a word. Excommunication of rats was another ritual. Priests sprinkled holy water, swung censers of incense, and read solemn pronouncements condemning rats to banishment. They treated vermin like wayward parishioners, capable of obedience if properly threatened with divine wrath. Some ceremonies invoked saints, asking them to drive rats away from vineyards and fields. In Burgundy during the 15th century, records describe whole congregations attending services designed to curse rodents. The townspeople prayed, the priests cursed, and you continued chewing grapevines in the dark. Historians interpret these rituals as a reflection of medieval cosmology. In a world where divine order governed everything, even vermin had to be addressed within that system. Rats could not be ignored, so they were folded into the same framework that governed humans. You were not just animals, you were subjects of law and religion, bound by words you never heard. The theatre of justice and liturgy became a coping mechanism. The sensory side of these events was dramatic. Picture villagers gathered in a cathedral, incense clouding the air, Latin chants echoing against stone. The smell of wax and smoke fills the nave while the priest curses rats with booming authority. Outside, meanwhile, your colony scratches and gnaws in the granary, unaffected. The irony was tangible. The louder the curses, the louder the squeaks. This absurdity was not limited to rats. Medieval courts also tried locusts, weevils, and even pigs. Animals that disrupted human life were pulled into the legal system, but rats featured most prominently because of their ubiquity. Grain theft, crop destruction, and plague all pointed back to you. Holding trials gave people the illusion of resistance. The fact that it accomplished nothing did not matter. The ritual itself was a kind of therapy. One of the strangest elements is how seriously lawyers took their roles. The defense of rats in autumn, arguing that the summons was unsafe due to cats, is preserved in legal records. It was a clever argument, playing the system to its logical extreme. If animals were expected to obey human summons, then surely their safety had to be considered. Rats became legal citizens for the duration of the case, their rights defended even as their tails twitched in fields. These legal spectacles reveal much about medieval psychology. People needed order, predictability, and justice in a world dominated by disease and famine. Rats undermined that order, breeding in shadows and ruining food stores. Trials allowed communities to vent their anger publicly, turning vermin into scapegoats. It was the same impulse that led to witch trials, only this time the witches had fur and long tails. Archaeologists sometimes uncover material evidence of these rituals. Manuscripts record prayers for protection against vermin, while marginal doodles of rats appear beside legal texts. The blending of lore and superstition left a paper trail as peculiar as the trials themselves. To modern readers it seems laughable. To those living with famine and plague it was deadly serious. The humour lies in the futility. Imagine a solemn judge announcing penalties against rats, while at that very moment rats run across the rafters above. The ceremony is both grand and pointless, like declaring war against the wind. You were not in the courtroom, you were in the pantry, nibbling dried peas, blissfully unaware that you had just been excommunicated. These trials did not stop infestations, they did not curb plague, yet they lingered for centuries, repeated with enough seriousness to fill records. They show how deeply rats were woven into medieval society, not only physically but conceptually. You were not just part of the environment, you were part of lore, ritual and imagination. And as ceremonies concluded, as incense faded and verdicts echoed into silence, you continued your work. Grain spoiled, fleas jumped, and rafters shook with squeaks. Humans had fought you with cats, traps, poisons, and now courts. None of it changed the fact that you were still there. Yet the obsession with you was not only about food and plague, it was about what you revealed in their world. In the next turn of history, your presence would collide with famine itself, where human desperation for bread and your appetite for grain became enemies on the same battlefield. The incense smoke fades from the courtroom and the chant of curses dies away, but hunger never stops. Grain stores run low, fields yield poorly, and humans tighten belts while you gnaw ropes. In times of famine, you're not just nuisance but rival. Every mouthful you steal is one they cannot have. You become their mirror in desperation, scratching at the same crumbs, clawing at the same scraps. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is one of the starkest examples. Relentless rains ruined harvests across northern Europe, leaving grain rotting in fields. Wheat prices soared, bread shrank in size, and malnutrition weakened whole communities. While humans starved, rats thrived. Damp barns, poorly sealed, overflowed with spoiled but edible grain. What peasants could not stomach, you devoured eagerly. Contemporary chroniclers describe barns infested with vermin even as people died in ditches outside. To the human eye, it was insult added to injury. To you, it was opportunity. Archaeological digs confirm the rivalry. Grain storage pits often contain gnawed husks dating to famine years, proof that rats competed directly with humans. In some cases the pits collapsed, perhaps undermined by burrows, further spoiling supplies. Imagine the fury of a starving family discovering that their final measure of rye had been riddled with holes, each kernel chewed into dust. Your teeth became as threatening as the rain clouds overhead. Hunger sharpened human hatred. In some villages, rats were clubbed in desperation, their bodies cooked and eaten. There are scattered accounts of rat meat appearing in famine diets, though always with disgust. Chroniclers record people driven to consume anything that moved. You went from competitor to reluctant sustenance, another bitter reminder of collapse. The irony was grotesque. The same creatures blamed for stealing bread sometimes ended up roasted on spits. The sensory world of famine was bleak. Fields smelled of mildew, bread was black and sour, and cellars reeked of rot. In this misery your squeaks carried like insults. At night, scratching in walls reminded hungry listeners that they were losing a battle in their own homes. They prayed for relief, but what they heard instead was the sound of rats thriving in scarcity. Your appetite exposed weaknesses in storage. Medieval granaries were poorly sealed, often built with wood or clay that yielded easily to your teeth. Metal containers were rare. Cloth sacks tore within days of gnawing. Rats forced humans to innovate, sometimes lining pits with stone or attempting fumigation with smoke. Yet famine years made fumigation impossible when every scrap of wood was needed for heat. You multiplied in unguarded spaces, your numbers swelling even as humans dwindled. The demographic impact of famine was catastrophic. Historians estimate millions perished during the Great Famine, long before plague ever arrived. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making communities more vulnerable to later outbreaks. In this sense, rats shaped history indirectly. By worsening shortages, by spoiling grain and spreading disease, you compounded disasters. Humans remembered rain and crop failure, but behind their walls the gnawing of rats was just as decisive. Folklore preserved the rivalry. In some tales, rats were depicted as demons sent to punish greed, their endless chewing symbolizing divine wrath. In others, they were omens, appearing in greater numbers before harvest failure. Villagers whispered that swarms of rats foretold bad seasons. It was not prophecy, but population ecology. Abundant rats meant abundant crops the year before, which only worsened the contrast when scarcity followed. Urban centres magnified the conflict. In cities where grain was imported and stored in bulk, infestations were worse. Records from Bruges and Lübeck mention complaints of rats in warehouses even during shortages. Merchants struggled to guard supplies, locking storerooms and stationing guards, yet you always found cracks. Guards may have kept thieves away, but they could not police whiskers slipping under doors. The humour of history lies in the futility. Humans cursed rats while rats kept chewing. They prayed for cats, traps and saints, yet none could match the pace of reproduction. A single female rat can birth dozens of pups in a year, each ready to gnaw by the time famine deepens. Every bite you took became another headline in the silent war over bread. The hunger also revealed the strange double standards of human society. Wealthy households could seal granaries with stone or import food from afar, reducing their vulnerability. Peasants had only wooden barns, easily breached. Rats became a symbol of inequality, thriving on stores the poor could not protect. The image of vermin feasting while peasants starved burned into cultural memory, shaping sermons, art and legal complaints. The famine years proved a lesson humans never forgot. Grain storage became central to economic policy, city planning and architecture. Granaries were reinforced, sometimes raised on stilts with stone bases to block rats. Yet even then, ingenuity met whiskers. Rats learned to climb, leap, and gnaw new paths. Progress was slow, often laughably outmatched by your persistence, and so you remained in the story of hunger, an enemy no less terrifying than rain. Your teeth were famine sharpened into miniature weapons. Your presence meant not only disease but also deprivation. You were not simply parasites of plenty. You were rivals of hunger itself, competitors locked in a grim contest that humans could never truly win. But hunger was only one battlefield. Beyond barns and cellars another space loomed large, one filled not with crops but with the rituals of food and the tables of feasts. And there, in kitchens and pantries, you found yet another stage on which to gnaw your way into history. Hunger gnaws at peasants, but in kitchens and feasting halls there is abundance. Roasted meats, fish pies, honey cakes, wheels of cheese stacked like shields. The scents fill corridors, drifting from hearths into rafters where you wait. You are the eternal banquet crasher, sliding under doors, climbing table legs and burrowing into pantries. Humans pride themselves on hospitality, but they cannot keep you from pulling up a chair. Medieval kitchens were chaos. Huge fireplaces smoked, spits creaked under the weight of roasting oxen, and cooks shouted above the crackle of flames. The bustle distracted them from the quiet scurrying in corners. Archaeological excavations of castle kitchens reveal gnawed bones scattered among charred remains, proof that rats dined alongside humans. To the wealthy, scraps were waste. To you, they were banquets. What nobles left behind became the staple of your colonies. Pantries were even more inviting. These storerooms, often adjoining kitchens, were lined with shelves of salted meat, flour and dried fruit. Locks kept out servants, but wood and cloth could not keep out teeth. Records from household accounts include complaints of food lost to vermin, entire sacks of flour reduced to dust. To you it was nothing extraordinary, to them it was insult to luxury. A noble might afford silks and jewels, but his larder still bowed to whiskers. Feasts amplified the opportunities. The medieval feast was an extravagant ritual, especially in royal courts. Dozens of dishes were prepared, more than could ever be eaten. What remained piled up in kitchens, tossed out back or stored badly for later. This excess created a permanent shadow economy for rats. Chronicles of great banquets often describe leftovers carried by cartloads to servants or thrown into streets. You were waiting either way, squeaking through alleys to drag away scraps fit for kings. The sensory explosion of a feast is overwhelming. The smell of roasting venison blends with spiced wine, the tang of pickled herring, the sweetness of almonds crushed into marzipan. For humans, this was indulgence. For you, it was chaos of opportunity. You taste everything, gnaw everything, smear your greasy paws on the same tables that displayed gilded platters. Guests sip from goblets, and above them in rafters, you chew noisily, unseen but very present. Monastic kitchens tell another story. Monks ate humbler fare, bread and pottage, sometimes fish or cheese. Yet even here, rats thrived. Cereal grains were stored in bulk for fasting seasons, and your teeth found their way in. Monastic rules often included penalties for waste, but gnawed stores counted as waste anyway. Quiet refectories echoed with chants while overhead. Colonies squeaked like unruly choirs. The contrast was comic. Piety below, scratching above. Cookbooks of the period, such as the English form of Curie, do not mention rats, but they did not need to. The silence proves how ingrained your presence was. Recipes for stews, pies, and sauces filled pages, but every cook knew to watch for droppings. You were not written about because you were too obvious. Everyone already knew the pantry had whiskers. Markets were extensions of this feast economy. Fishmongers, bakers, and butchers sold goods in open stalls, often without covers. At night, stalls were left vulnerable. Rats darted through baskets, gnawed at loaves and nibbled at salted fish. Excavations of medieval market sites reveal gnawed scales, cracked shells, and fragments of bread crusts, signs of nightly feasts unseen by customers. The market bell rang each morning, but rats had already held their own midnight fare. The irony is sharp. The wealthier the kitchen, the better you ate. Nobles feasted on imported spices, exotic fruits, and wines shipped from afar. Their scraps were your delicacies. A chewed fig or gnawed almond was rarer in a peasant's diet than in yours. Rat colonies in castles ate better than most peasants in villages. History's most unwanted guest became history's most privileged diner. Humans noticed, of course. Household manuals sometimes recommended storing food in stone jars or suspending it from ceilings. These precautions slowed you, but rarely stopped you. Rats could climb ropes, chew lids, and leap from beams. You became part of the design of kitchens themselves. Some households even employed boys specifically to guard larders at night, a miserable job paid in scraps, often lost to you anyway. The connection between feasts and plague is another cruel twist. Surpluses stored in kitchens attracted rats. Rats carried fleas, and fleas carried disease. In this way, noble banquets contributed indirectly to outbreaks. Guests dined on venison while fleas itched on rats just outside the hall. The gulf between glitter and gnawing was thinner than they realized. The humor lies in how unshakable you were. No amount of pomp or ritual dining could eliminate your presence. A king might dine from a silver dish, but a rat could still chew the bread before it reached his mouth. Chronicles describing coronations or weddings omit you, yet the archaeological record fills in the silence with teeth marks and droppings. Every celebration had its shadow guest list. and you were always at the table, and so kitchens and feasts became as central to your world as sewers and cellars. You thrived on human excess, turned their luxury into your sustenance, and slipped unnoticed into their rituals of wealth and status. But food is not the only lure. Beyond kitchens lies another battlefield, one filled with parchment, ink, and the quiet scratching of quills. For where humans kept books and knowledge, rats found just as much to chew. The pantry door closes, the last scraps are cleared, and you scurry onward. Ahead is not food, but parchment. Shelves creak with manuscripts, their bindings of leather and vellum glowing faintly in candlelight. To humans they are treasure, decades of labour bound in ink and gold leaf. To you they are chew toys, insulation, and the occasional snack. Libraries are supposed to preserve memory, but with rats in the rafters, memory is always negotiable. Medieval books were especially vulnerable because they were organic. Vellum was animal skin, scraped and stretched, and still carried the faint scent of flesh. Leather bindings tanned imperfectly retained oils that appealed to gnawing teeth. Starch used in paste and glue added another treat, turning bindings into edible puzzles. Archaeologists studying medieval book damage often find neat crescent marks from rodent incisors, silent evidence of your night shifts as librarians. Monasteries were the most common sites of this battle. Scriptoriums produced endless manuscripts, each taking months or even years to complete. Monks copied Bibles, commentaries and legal texts in silence, only to discover holes and teeth marks weeks later. Some manuscripts even include marginal notes complaining about rats. One scribe in the 12th century scrawled a short curse against vermin into the corner of a page, begging that rats leave his work alone. The ink remains, the gnaw marks remain too. Your rebuttal was permanent. The sensory detail of a library is different from a kitchen. The air smells of dust, wax and vellum, with faint undertones of ink and mildew. For you it is a feast of textures. Leather softening with age yields under your teeth. Paper crunches faintly when shredded for nests. The sound of chewing echoes oddly in the stillness, blending with the scratch of quills. Monks heard their own labour mirrored above them, ink scratching below, teeth scratching above. Historians treasure these rat signatures. Chewed bindings help date infestations. Droppings found between pages reveal not only your presence, but sometimes your diet, grains embedded alongside ink stains. Whole collections were lost to you, particularly during times of neglect. When monasteries were abandoned during plague outbreaks, books left unattended became nests. Excavated libraries show volumes riddled with tunnels, as if the very words were devoured. You did not read theology, but you edited it all the same. The humour is sharp. Humans wrote treatises about the order of the universe, about salvation and divine law, only for rats to chew holes directly through the arguments. A biting critique in the most literal sense. Imagine a monk expounding on eternal truth while holding a page with missing corners gnawed into nothing. Philosophy reduced to pulp by whiskers. Theology undermined by squeaks. University libraries fared no better. As centres of learning grew in Paris, Bologna and Oxford, collections expanded. Yet their libraries were rarely well protected. Books were chained to desks to prevent theft by humans, but no chains deterred you. Students crammed into reading rooms might find droppings among their tomes. Complaints survive in letters about vermin chewing parchment or nesting in lecture halls. Knowledge advanced, but always with scratch marks in the margins. Even great archives could not escape. Royal chanceries stored legal documents, land grants and treaties in wooden chests, many later discovered gnawed. In some cases, entire rolls of parchment were damaged beyond recognition. Imagine centuries of land claims undone not by politics but by incisors. Historians piecing together these fragments sometimes find that your teeth erased lines that might have changed disputes. You were not only nuisance but unintended editor of kingdoms. The irony deepens when you consider preservation. Modern conservators sometimes encounter rat damage as a diagnostic tool, revealing how books were stored, where they were hidden, and how long they were neglected. In this way, your destruction became historical evidence. By chewing pages, you left clues for archaeologists centuries later. Rats not only ruined knowledge, they created new knowledge of ruin. Folklore absorbed this reality too. In some tales, rats were said to whisper secrets because they were always among books. The association of rats with hidden knowledge or forbidden truth emerged from real infestations. If anyone knew what was in the walls of monasteries and universities, it was the rats. Squeaks became imagined as gossip, knowledge leaking in vermin voices. The broader cultural meaning is unavoidable. If books were the guardians of civilization, rats were its silent critics. Every time a monk dipped his quill, you dipped your teeth. Every time a library locked its doors, you slipped under. You demonstrated that memory could be as fragile as a piece of leather. Humans tried to preserve eternity in ink, and you reminded them it all remained edible. And so the battle of books became another stage of your life. Kitchens fed you, but libraries entertained you. Grain spoiled, but parchment shredded more smoothly. Knowledge was gnawed line by line, turned into nests and droppings. You were not simply the eater of food, you were the consumer of history itself, transforming grand manuscripts into bedding for pups. But even as you shredded parchment and feasted on bindings, another stage of human life opened itself to you. Not kitchens, not libraries, but the very spaces where humans sought rest. Beds, clothing, and the fibres of daily life became your next frontier, filled with warmth, wool, and the scratching misery of cohabitation. The book leaves your teeth, the parchment fibres scatter, and you follow warmth instead of words. Firelight fades in the scriptorium, but in the next room lies something softer. Straw mattresses stuffed loosely, wool blankets piled thick, clothing hung from pegs on walls. For humans, these are comforts, tokens against cold nights and aching bones. For you, they are tunnels of warmth, perfect insulation, and endless material for nests. You're not only in kitchens and libraries, you're in their beds. Medieval bedding was crude by modern standards. Mattresses were sacks filled with straw, reeds, or sometimes feathers if one could afford them. Straw compressed over time, growing damp and riddled with insects. To you, this was paradise. You burrow through the stalks, gnawing paths until the sack bulges with squeaks. Archaeologists analysing bedding from preserved medieval houses often find rodent droppings mixed with straw, direct evidence of your nightly occupation. Every time a human shifted in their sleep, there was a good chance a whisker brushed against them unseen. Clothing too was vulnerable. Wool cloaks, linen shirts, and leather boots all tempted your teeth. In cold months, stored garments carried the faint smell of sweat and oils, flavours that drew you in. Gnawed shoes discovered in medieval cesspits confirm how often rats targeted leather. Even preserved burial clothes sometimes show rodent damage, as if you attended funerals uninvited, chewing at garments long after mourners left. The sensory world of a medieval bedroom was not restful. The smell of damp straw, the itch of lice, the scuttle of fleas, and the faint squeak of movement in walls all combined into a symphony of discomfort. Rats added their own contributions, scratching under floorboards, rustling through straw, and sometimes running directly across sleeping bodies. Chroniclers complained about rats invading chambers, one describing how people woke to find their hair chewed while they slept. The indignity of sharing a bed with vermin became part of the nightmare of domestic life. Yet it was not only straw and cloth you targeted. Food often followed people into their beds. In cold winters, peasants and even nobles stored bread or cheese near them to avoid theft in communal kitchens. You smelled it instantly. Night raids across blankets became routine, your teeth sinking into loaves while humans dreamed. The crumbs left behind confirmed the theft, but the thief was gone by dawn. You were the bedfellow they never invited, yet never rid themselves of. Clothing storage was another battlefield. Chests made of wood housed garments and linens. But wood is always vulnerable. Your incisors carve through lids, granting access to wool and fur linings. Fur collars were especially tempting, warm and oily, irresistible for nesting. Excavated chests from medieval towns sometimes show gnaw marks along edges, a permanent reminder that no fabric was safe from your touch. The irony of this invasion is profound. People built beds to rest from their labour, only to find themselves cohabiting with colonies of vermin. Medical writers of the period often advised shaking out straw regularly to avoid infestation, but this rarely solved the problem. Straw was replaced seasonally at best, often left to compact for years. That meant generations of rats lived and died within the same mattresses. The phrase, "don't let the bedbugs bite," has deeper medieval roots, but it could just as easily have been, "don't let the rats chew." The fleas that travelled with you ensured misery multiplied. Sharing a mattress with rats meant sharing with parasites. Rat fleas did not discriminate, biting humans as easily as their hosts. In this way, the bedroom became another stage of contagion. While physicians focused on bad air or divine punishment, the true culprits hopped between straw and skin each night. The intimacy of sleep meant humans lay exposed to the same vectors that had already devastated their streets. Clothing also carried rats beyond the home. Markets selling second-hand garments, common in cities, often contained hidden stowaways. Buyers carried home cloaks or sacks already nibbled or even inhabited. Flea eggs lodged in cloth spread from one household to another. In this way, rats moved not only through rafters but through wardrobes. The trade of used clothing meant to clothe the poor cheaply became another vector for infestation. The humour, as always, lies in the mismatch of effort and outcome. People washed sheets, aired straw, patched clothes, and set cats in chambers, yet every morning droppings reappeared. A nobleman's velvet cloak might bear the same marks as a peasant's coarse tunic. The rat was the great equalizer of wardrobes, chewing through class distinctions as easily as cloth. Even royal courts were not exempt. In palace inventories, missing garments and damaged furs are occasionally attributed to vermin. Imagine a king draped in ermine robes, only to discover the hem frayed by whiskers. Luxury meant nothing to teeth honed on beams and books. Rats were oblivious to status. To you, ermine fur and peasant wool were equally warm in a nest. Archaeology preserves your textile legacy. Fragments of gnawed wool and chewed linen appear in cesspits and middens across Europe. Rat bones lie beside scraps of cloth, evidence of colonies thriving within domestic life. In burials, coffins sometimes contain garments with rodent damage, proof that even death did not shield fabric from your teeth. The past is littered with gnawed fibres, a patchwork of history rewritten by incisors. You were not just in granaries and sewers, you were in beds, blankets, cloaks, and boots. You shaped the sensory texture of medieval life, from the scratch of straw at night to the hole in a wool hood at dawn. Humans cursed you as plague-bearer and thief, but in their most private spaces they also cursed you as roommate. The domestic world was porous, and you slipped into every seam. But your presence in fabric and bedding was not the end of your domestic invasion. Beyond homes and wardrobes, rats burrowed into fields and farms, turning agriculture itself into a battlefield. Grain in barns was only the beginning. In the soil itself, among crops and roots, you carved out another empire of teeth. The warmth of blankets fades, the rustle of straw beds is behind you, and the open fields stretch wide. Here too your presence is constant. Humans plough, sow and reap, bending their backs to coax food from soil. You scuttle along the furrows, tunnelling in dikes, burrowing near hedges, and darting into barns. Their work is your inheritance. Every seed they plant is another opportunity for theft. Medieval agriculture was always precarious. A single storm, flood, or drought could ruin crops. Yet even in good years, rats cut into the margin. You dug into root vegetables, stripped ears of grain, and stored what you could not eat. Archaeologists examining medieval field systems find rat burrows dug deep into dikes, disrupting irrigation. What peasants saw as sudden crop failure sometimes began with tiny whiskers underground. Your teeth were not only in pantries, they were in the soil itself. Barns magnified the problem. Harvested grain was stacked in sheaves, then stored loosely before threshing. You burrowed into these piles, creating hollow tunnels. From the outside, the stacks looked full. Inside, they were eaten through, collapsing when touched. Records from medieval England include complaints of rats spoiling entire barns of wheat or barley. For farmers already living close to subsistence, a rat colony could turn survival into famine. The sensory world of the farm was rich. The smell of cut hay mixed with manure, the rustle of stalks swaying in wind, the steady drone of insects. Into this world came the squeak of rats, quick movements through furrows, sudden rustles in hedges. Farmers knew the sound. Their dogs barked at shadows, cats prowled, children chased with sticks. Yet still you multiplied, your squeaks echoing across fields as much a part of the countryside as birdsong. Folklore absorbed this reality. In many villages, rats were tied to omens of harvest luck. A sudden increase in rat sightings could be read as a sign of poor yields to come. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, farmers believed rats carried away prosperity itself, stealing not only grain but fortune. Rituals developed to drive them out, from shouting charms in the fields to burying magical tokens near barns. None of it worked, but it gave people a sense of action. Medieval chronicles confirm the scale of destruction. In 1257, reports from Flanders describe swarms of rats overrunning villages during poor harvest years. Chroniclers called it a plague of vermin, equating the flood of whiskers with biblical punishments. These infestations often coincided with weather shifts, but rats bore the blame. Priests preached against sin while farmers cursed at tunnels in their fields. Superstition reached comic levels. In some places, people staged symbolic expulsions. Rats were declared banished from fields in formal ceremonies, sometimes involving priests chanting over furrows. The rats, of course, remained, chewing roots beneath the surface as prayers rose above. The disconnect between ritual and reality was stark. Faith addressed heaven, teeth addressed barley. Your impact extended to livestock too. Barns that sheltered animals also sheltered you. Hay stacked for cattle was tunnelled through, spoiling fodder with droppings and gnaw marks. Pigs rooting in sties occasionally unearthed rat colonies. Chickens scratched nervously when shadows darted across straw. In rural economies where animals were wealth, rats became silent rivals, nibbling at the very resources that fed cows, pigs, and poultry. Archaeology again reveals your presence. Excavations of medieval farmsteads frequently uncover gnawed bones among midden heaps, evidence of rats feasting on scraps alongside livestock. Soil samples sometimes show rat droppings in threshing floors, a detail invisible to chroniclers but undeniable in chemical traces. History preserves your partnership with the plough in layers of dirt as well as parchment. The irony is clear. Farmers laboured for months to coax crops from poor soil, only to watch whiskers claim the harvest in nights. Traps and cats were deployed constantly, but neither kept pace with reproduction. A single breeding pair in a barn could undo the work of an entire season. The peasants bore the loss. You bore the gains. The rivalry entered Proverbs too. Phrases comparing wasteful or greedy people to rats gnawing in granaries appear across European languages. The imagery was obvious and universal. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had lost grain to it. Your hunger shaped language itself, embedding squeaks and sayings still recognizable centuries later. Even taxation records reveal the impact. Lords demanded tithes of grain from peasants, usually 1/10 of a harvest. But infestations reduced what was deliverable. Some accounts note shortages attributed to vermin. The irony is brutal. Peasants paid their dues whether rats had eaten their share or not. The burden of your appetite fell hardest on the already hungry. You were not only thieves of grain, but accelerators of inequality. The humour emerges in how futile resistance remained. Villagers beat the edges of fields with sticks, set fires in burrows, and cursed loudly at the night. Rats still came back. The next generation was already waiting in hidden nests. Human anger, no matter how theatrical, never closed the tunnels. In a way, you were as much a crop as the barley itself, harvested in squeaks whether invited or not. And from the soil and barns you carried your empire into yet another human domain. For when food is scarce and homes are weak, there is one place that becomes central to survival. The church looms above fields and villages, a stone fortress of faith. And even in those hallowed halls, where incense rises and bells toll, the scratching of rats continues. The fields fade behind you, barns vanish into dusk, and the church rises above the village. Towering stone, tolling bells, incense drifting into evening air. To humans, this is sanctuary. To you, it is yet another roof, another granary, another place to tunnel. Faith may raise arches, but arches still have cracks. You slip into the house of God as easily as you slip into a kitchen. Medieval churches were designed to awe. Vaulted ceilings, stained glass, and carved wood spoke of divine majesty. Yet grandeur did not keep out vermin. Behind the painted altars lay cupboards of communion bread stored in wooden chests. To parishioners this bread was sacred, transformed into the body of Christ. To rats it was flour pressed into chewable wafers. There are scattered records of vermin spoiling sacramental bread, a crisis that forced priests to rebake urgently. To chew holes in communion was more than theft. It was desecration by whiskers. Candle wax and tallow lamps added more temptation. Candles made with animal fat carried strong scents, irresistible to teeth already sharpened on beams. Archaeologists have recovered candle fragments gnawed by rodents from monastic sites, proof that churches glowed not only for worship but for rats feasting in shadow. Imagine the scene. Worshippers kneeling in prayer while above them in the rafters, rats gnaw quietly at the very light of the service. Reliquaries, those glittering containers for holy remains, were not always secure. Many were wooden boxes plated with metal, and where wood showed, rats chewed. Chronicles mention churches infested so badly that rats desecrated not only bread and candles, but also burial crypts beneath altars. Bones disturbed by whiskers unsettled communities deeply. In their eyes, vermin were more than nuisance. They were agents of spiritual corruption, physical reminders of sin gnawing at sanctity. Monasteries faced the problem daily. Cloisters echoed with chants, but also with squeaks. The rule of St. Benedict demanded order, silence, and cleanliness, yet rodents undermined every command. Kitchens in monasteries stored cereals for fasting days, libraries stored books, dormitories stored straw bedding. All became habitats. Excavations at Cluny Abbey in France revealed rat bones throughout its layers, proof that even the greatest monastic empire could not keep out vermin. The irony is sharp. Monks fought spiritual temptation while whiskers chewed the corners of their manuscripts. The sensory clash of church and rat is striking. The smell of incense meant to lift prayers upward, mingled with the musty odour of droppings in corners. The solemn sound of chant mixed with scratching in the beams. The flicker of candlelight revealed not only painted saints, but shadows darting along walls. Faith demanded transcendence, yet vermin dragged it back to the floorboards. Superstition flourished here too. Rats in churches were often interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. A sudden infestation near the altar could be read as punishment for sin or warning of plague. Priests attempted exorcisms, sprinkling holy water and chanting to banish vermin. In one account from the 15th century Germany, an entire congregation gathered as priests cursed rats out of the churchyard. The rats, of course, returned by nightfall, undeterred by blessings. Art reinforced the image. Marginal illustrations in religious manuscripts sometimes depict rats gnawing chalices or scampering near demons. The connection between vermin and evil was carved into the cultural imagination. In stained glass windows rats rarely appear, but devils often have rat-like features. To medieval eyes, your squeak was the sound of temptation itself, and yet you were also treated with bizarre practicality. Cathedrals often kept cats on payroll, their service considered as important as bell ringers or glaziers. Cathedral accounts from Exeter and other English towns list payments for keeping cats to control vermin. Even in the holiest spaces, divine protection was not trusted alone. Whiskers demanded whiskers in response. Archaeological finds add texture to the story. Crypts beneath churches sometimes contain gnawed coffins, evidence that rats feasted on corpses interred within. The thought horrified parishioners, who saw it as corruption of sacred burial. Yet to you it was another larder, another space of survival. Sanctity was meaningless against hunger. Stone sealed humans in. Teeth unsealed them again. The humour emerges from the futility. Imagine priests chanting solemnly while rats squeak in chorus, a duet of piety and pestilence. Imagine holy bread chewed to crumbs, candles gnawed mid-service, relic boxes rattling faintly in the night. Faith promised eternal order. Rats delivered immediate chaos. The war between sanctity and squeaks was as eternal as that between cats and tails, and as you scuttle from altar to crypt, from bread chest to candle box, you reveal the limits of human control. If even churches could not bar rats, then what hope had houses or barns? The answer was none. You were universal, invading every space regardless of walls or prayers. From sacred halls the story flows outward again. Beyond altars and chants lies another realm where rats thrived not on holiness but on commerce. For in the bustling markets of medieval towns, where coins clinked and stalls groaned under goods, you found yet another empire to chew. The bells of the church fade and the noise of the market swells. Wooden stalls creak under the weight of goods, coins clink, voices shout prices, and the air is heavy with the smell of fish, onions, leather, and sweat. To humans, this is the beating heart of the town. To you it is another banquet, another labyrinth of baskets and barrels, another stage to slip unseen while men haggle and women gossip. Markets in medieval Europe were not polite supermarkets. They were chaotic, crowded and noisy. Butchers chopped carcasses on open tables, bakers stacked loaves in piles, fishmongers displayed salted herring under buzzing flies. The stalls were temporary, often nothing more than planks set across barrels. By night they were abandoned, and that was your hour. Rats scurried across counters, gnawed through cloth sacks and dragged scraps into drains. Archaeological excavations of medieval market squares often uncover layers of fish bones and bread crusts riddled with gnaw marks, evidence of your nightly commerce. You were not only after food, markets were also money. Coins were stored in wooden chests or leather pouches. Many were hidden under tables or buried shallow in stalls overnight. Leather, being organic, carried the scent of fat and oils tempting to teeth. Numerous records describe coin purses chewed through, coins spilled among droppings. To humans, this was theft. To rats, it was accident. No economy in history has been as rudely interrupted by whiskers. Merchants complained bitterly. In London, ordinances warned sellers to keep goods properly covered to prevent vermin, yet coverings meant cloth, which you chewed. In Lübeck and Bruges, guild records include fines for spoiled goods, with rats often listed as the cause. Imagine a baker fined for stale bread only because rats had already tasted it. Commerce became yet another ledger of your presence. The sensory overload of the market made you invisible. The squeaks of rats blended with the squeals of pigs, the rustle of sacks with the chatter of crowds. Humans stepped over scraps without noticing the quick movements in shadows. At night the sensory landscape changed. The clamour fell silent, but your colony made its own music. Squeaks echoed between stalls, claws scratched along planks, and the metallic clatter of a coin pouch dropped by teeth punctuated the darkness. Folklore turned markets into sites of rat legends. In some towns, people swore that seeing rats run boldly through stalls foretold bad business or even fire. In others, merchants muttered that rats followed dishonest traders as divine punishment. Rats became moral judges, their presence interpreted as cosmic balance. Of course, the truth was simpler. Where food gathered, rats gathered. Morality had nothing to do with it. Ships fed these markets, and with them came rats from other ports. The grain unloaded in London, Paris or Genoa carried not only food, but colonies. This made markets hubs of disease as well as trade. The plague of 1347 spread through ports first, then inland through markets. Chroniclers noted how towns fell silent after weeks of bustling fairs. The very centres of commerce transformed into empty squares of tolling bells. Rats were blamed, though again the fleas did the true work. Still, the image of rats darting between abandoned stalls became a chilling emblem of contagion. The architecture of markets also favoured you. Many were built with cellars beneath, where goods were stored in bulk. These dark, damp rooms became permanent nests. Excavations in York and Lubeck have revealed rat bones in market basements, proof of colonies living under centuries of trade. Above, humans measured grain and counted coins. Below, whiskers twitched in the dark. The irony is sharp. Markets symbolized wealth and abundance, yet rats turned that abundance into their own empire. Every loaf, every fish, every onion was vulnerable. Merchants prided themselves on exotic imports like pepper or cinnamon, yet rats chewed through spice sacks as eagerly as barley. Historians studying cargo lists often note discrepancies, goods missing in transit or spoiled before sale. Behind those numbers, you can almost hear the scratching. Humour lurks in the details. Imagine a merchant boasting of silk imported from the East, only to lift the cloth and reveal rat holes chewed into the pattern. Imagine a fishmonger displaying his best herring, while rats nibble the tails behind his stall. Commerce demanded polish. Rats delivered chaos. The disconnect was comic even when ruinous. Markets also became battlegrounds of pest control. Rat catchers roamed fairs offering services, showing off dead vermin as proof of skill. Ferrets were sometimes unleashed into stalls at night, their slinking bodies flushing rats into nets. Town records mention such spectacles, half business, half entertainment. Crowds gathered not only to buy bread, but to watch vermin hunted in the square. The squeals of rats became part of market noise, as familiar as bargaining voices. Yet the war never ended. Rats always returned, multiplying in alleys, breeding in sewers beneath stalls, darting through barns at the edge of town. The merchant's shadow was always whiskered. For every rat caught, a dozen pups replaced it. Markets expanded, trade flourished, and rats flourished alongside. And so you thrived in the centres of medieval commerce, equal parts nuisance and inevitability. Grain, coins, spices, fabrics, fish, and bread all bore your mark. Humans believed markets were theirs, symbols of prosperity and growth. In truth, every stall, every chest, every cellar was shared with you. But commerce was not the only arena where rats made themselves at home. Beyond stalls and coins lay the world of war itself. For on battlefields, in camps, and among the wounded, rats found another empire to chew, turning war into yet another feast. The clamour of markets fades into the clash of arms. Trumpets blare, banners snap in wind, and the air is heavy with iron and smoke. To men it is war, with glory, strategy, and honour at stake. To you it is something simpler. It is food. Wherever soldiers march, rats follow. Battlefields are your harvest fields, siege camps your banquets, war itself a generator of endless scraps. Armies of the Middle Ages moved slowly, dragging carts of bread, salted pork, dried peas, and barrels of ale. These supplies were often stored poorly. wrapped in cloth sacks or stacked in wooden barrels. You gnawed through both with ease. Chronicles of campaigns in France and the Holy Roman Empire mention vermin devouring rations before soldiers could eat them. Hunger often defeated armies more effectively than swords. Rats, unseen in the narrative of glory, were the true tacticians. Sieges amplified your reign. A besieged city stockpiled grain, meat, and water, sealing gates to outlast the enemy. But sealing gates sealed rats inside as well. Chronicles from the 100 Years' War describe cities where vermin thrived while humans starved. Grain meant for defenders was spoiled, gnawed, or contaminated with droppings. Archaeological evidence from besieged sites often shows layers of rat bones mixed with human remains, proof that colonies multiplied even as soldiers died. The sensory landscape of siege was misery, the stench of waste, the groans of hunger, the smoke of fires smouldering under stone walls. Into this came the squeaks of rats darting between cellars and alleys, thriving on scraps and corpses. To defenders, rats were mockery incarnate. As bread dwindled and hunger gnawed, whiskers scurried fat and quick. The enemy outside the walls was terrifying. The enemy inside the walls was worse. On battlefields themselves, rats claimed victory before men did. After combat ended, bodies lay unburied for days, sometimes weeks. Chroniclers of wars in Italy, France, and Eastern Europe remark on vermin swarming the fields, gnawing flesh, dragging scraps into burrows. Archaeological digs confirm it, with gnaw marks on bones unearthed from medieval mass graves. The clang of steel might decide the day, but the scratching of teeth wrote the aftermath. Folk memory absorbed this gruesome reality. Soldiers told stories of rats feasting on the dead, embellishing details until whiskers became demonic in rumour. In some regions, seeing swarms of rats on a battlefield was considered a bad omen for the next fight. Rats became symbols of war's futility, the real inheritors of the slain. Glory belonged to kings, corpses belonged to rats. Camp life was equally vulnerable. Soldiers lived in tents, their rations stacked nearby, their bedding little more than straw. Rats ran freely at night, bold enough to chew leather straps, boots, and even scabbards. Written accounts complain of vermin gnawing shields and belts, stripping grease from any material that had touched fat or oil. In some sieges, leather itself was eaten by starving men, but only after rats had already taken their share. Your role in spreading plague was magnified in these conditions. Fleas thrived in the crowded, unsanitary camps. Soldiers sleeping on straw or huddling in barns carried the same parasites as rats. During outbreaks, armies collapsed, not from arrows or swords, but from fever and buboes. The Black Death halted campaigns across Europe, decimating forces before battles could be fought. War and plague walked hand in hand, and rats were the bridge between them. The irony was brutal. Military strategy emphasized fortifications, cavalry charges, and supply lines, yet none of it addressed whiskers. Generals might command thousands of men but still lose to teeth the size of peas. Rats ignored treaties, trampled banners, and disrespected honour. They followed armies not as allies or enemies, but as inevitable scavengers. Even naval battles bore your mark. Warships carried supplies just like merchant vessels, and infestations were just as bad. Sailors and soldiers alike cursed the gnawing in the holds, the spoiled bread, and the chewed rigging. Naval records mention vermin as hazards equal to storms. Victory at sea did not guarantee victory in the hold. Rats claimed their own spoils regardless of the flag flown above. Archaeology once again testifies. Rat bones appear in excavation layers of medieval forts, castles, and battle camps. Their presence is universal. In mass graves, gnaw marks show how quickly vermin arrived after slaughter. In castle cellars, tunnels cut through grain storage reveal years of infestation. History remembers kings and knights. Dirt remembers rats. Humour creeps in through futility. Imagine a knight polishing armour before a battle. only to discover that rats have chewed through the straps of his gauntlets. Imagine a soldier standing watch while behind him, rats drag away his dinner. Honour on the field, humiliation in the tent, the squeak undermined the trumpet, and so rats became invisible victors. You were never listed in chronicles of campaigns, yet you haunted every page between the lines. Sieges starved defenders not only because armies surrounded them, but because rats shared their bread. Battlefields reeked not only of sweat and iron, but of the quiet work of whiskers cleaning up after carnage. Camps crumbled not only from mutiny, but from infestation. From the clash of swords, your path leads naturally to another arena. Where there is death, there are graves, and where there are graves, there are tunnels. Beyond war, beyond battle, beyond famine and feasts, rats found permanence in the soil of the dead. For even in sanctity of burial, the scratching never ceased. The clash of battle fades into silence, and silence fades into bells. Bodies are carried not into kitchens or barns now, but into the earth. To humans, the grave is the end, a sealed resting place of dignity. To you, it is another chamber, another hollow, another opportunity. Where men see eternity, rats see shelter. The cemetery is not only for the dead, it is for the living that scurry unseen. Medieval burial grounds were rarely secure. Graves were dug shallow, often hastily, especially during plague years. Wooden coffins, when used at all, were nailed crudely, easily split by time and weather. Earth settled unevenly, leaving cracks for whiskers. Archaeologists excavating plague pits across London, Lubeck and Milan often uncover rodent tunnels weaving directly through layers of skeletons. Bones gnawed, clean, carry your signature, incisors etching history with unflattering precision. Plague pits were the worst. During the Black Death, cemeteries overflowed with corpses. Chroniclers describe bodies stacked like firewood, sometimes covered with only a thin layer of soil. To rats, this was an endless harvest. Contemporary witnesses noted vermin swarming burial grounds, their presence turning grief into horror. Priests chanted requiems while whiskers rustled beneath the soil. The dead could not complain, but the living whispered in fear that even sacred ground was violated. Crypts beneath churches offered little more security. Stone walls blocked rain, but not rats. Many crypts doubled as storage, filled with coffins, relics, and occasionally food supplies for priests. Once whiskers found a way inside, crypts became permanent colonies. Excavations beneath cathedrals have revealed gnawed coffins, scattered bones, and droppings layered over centuries. Faith promised eternal peace. Teeth delivered eternal disturbance. The sensory world of the graveyard was grim. Damp earth, the sweet sick smell of decay, the faint incense drifting from funerals above. Into this you brought scratching, squeaking, the shuffle of paws through soil. For mourners, grief was sharpened by these sounds. Death was supposed to end in dignity, yet vermin made sure it continued underground. Superstition followed. In many villages, rats seen near graves were taken as signs of restless souls or divine punishment. Folk stories warned that the dead would not sleep easy if vermin nested in their graves. Some even believed rats carried away the spirits of the unworthy, dragging them squeaking into shadows. It was not theology, but it reflected the unease people felt when teeth met bone in the place meant for silence. Legal and religious authorities struggled with the issue. Cemeteries were consecrated, but consecration did not keep out vermin. Priests performed blessings, sprinkled holy water, and occasionally tried exorcisms, treating rats as demonic intruders. None of it worked. The scratching resumed as soon as the candles were extinguished. Rats were not bound by liturgy. Archaeological evidence supports the scale of the problem. In some plague pits, bones bear tiny parallel grooves unmistakable as rodent gnaw marks. These are not dramatic clawings, but methodical nibbles, done slowly in darkness. Soil samples from burial grounds often contain rat droppings mixed with human remains. The dead became bedding, coffins became nests, eternity became temporary. The irony is sharp. Humans built monumental tombs for kings, lined with treasure, carved with epitaphs proclaiming glory. Yet in many such tombs, rats left their own inscriptions in the form of chew marks on cloth and wood. Greatness did not deter whiskers. Rich or poor, buried in rags or silk, all were equal in the teeth of rats. Folklore sometimes leaned into this irony. Ballads warned that vanity was pointless, because rats would chew silk robes as easily as homespun cloth. Tales of vermin infesting tombs circulated widely, reinforcing the idea that worldly wealth could not prevent decay. Death may have been the great equalizer, but rats were its most efficient assistants. The psychological weight of this was heavy. Families visited graves expecting peace, only to hear squeaks or see burrows nearby. Chroniclers noted that some mourners placed heavy stones over fresh graves to deter vermin. In plague years, when burials were rushed, stones were sometimes omitted, and infestations multiplied. Rats became part of grief, woven into mourning rituals as unwanted companions. The humour, however dark, lies in the futility. Imagine a solemn funeral, priests chanting, mourners weeping, while rats slip quietly between feet, already scouting the fresh soil. The ceremony proclaims dignity. The reality proclaims gnawing. It is tragic and absurd at once, a reminder that death offers no true insulation from whiskers. And as cemeteries filled, as plague pits deepened, as crypts echoed with squeaks, humans confronted a reality they could never escape. Rats were not only their rivals in life, but their tenants in death. The scratching in the soil was eternal, a sound as much a part of the medieval graveyard as tolling bells. Yet even as rats ruled the earth of cemeteries, another empire awaited above ground. Beyond graves and crypts rose cities of trade and travel, where wagons creaked, inns bustled, and roads stretched endlessly. And on every road, in every cart and every inn, rats scurried with travellers, turning movement itself into another frontier. The soil of graves is still, but the roads of Europe are never quiet. Wagons creak, hooves clop, wheels jolt over ruts, merchants haul goods from fairs, pilgrims tramp toward shrines, soldiers march in columns. Where humans move, rats move too. You do not need maps, coins, or passports. You ride for free, tucked in carts, hidden in sacks, scuttling across the floorboards of inns. In the medieval world, rats were the most reliable travellers. Merchants carried you unintentionally with every shipment. Grain sacks on carts bulged with your nests, tiny squeaks lost in the rumble of wheels. Archaeological evidence from preserved carts and storage barns shows gnawed corners of sacks, proof of vermin living inside shipments themselves. A merchant might travel for weeks across Europe believing he transported rye or barley, unaware that he also transported colonies. Rats turned trade routes into migration routes, spreading not just goods but squeaks across the continent. Inns along the roads were no safer. These roadside establishments offered food, drink and lodging to weary travellers. To you they offered the same, kitchens filled with bread, beer barrels, scraps of meat, and the straw mattresses upstairs made them perfect. Chroniclers occasionally complain of vermin in inns, travellers waking to find holes chewed in their baggage, or droppings near their beds. The innkeeper poured ale downstairs, while upstairs, rats gnawed straps off saddlebags. Pilgrims were another vehicle. The movement of thousands toward holy sites like Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury created temporary towns of bodies, baggage, and bread. Pilgrim hostels stored food communally, often with little security. Rats slipped easily into these spaces, feeding on offerings, scraps, and the baggage of the faithful. Archaeologists excavating pilgrim roads sometimes find rat bones in hostel refuse pits, confirming that vermin joined every journey. While pilgrims prayed for safe passage, rats gnawed it out of their packs. The sensory landscape of travel carried its own absurdities. Roads smelled of manure, dust, and sweat. The jolt of wooden wheels rattled goods. Dogs barked in villages, bells rang in monasteries, crows cawed over fields, and beneath it all faint rustles came from sacks, squeaks from cart corners, scratching from chests stacked high. To most travellers, these noises faded into the background. To you they were the music of migration. Plague itself spread along these roads, and rats were part of the equation. The great outbreak of 1347 to 1351 followed trade routes, entering towns with wagons, merchants and soldiers. Fleas travelled with rats, hopping to humans in cramped inns or crowded carts. Roads became veins of contagion, pumping disease across Europe. Chroniclers recorded towns emptied within days of contact with travellers, unaware that the true passengers were smaller, furrier, and hidden in luggage. Folklore marked your presence. Some travellers swore that seeing rats cross the road in front of a wagon was a bad omen, a sign of delays or theft. Others believed that rats leaving a cart foretold a broken wheel, or a robbery ahead. These superstitions reflect the reality that where rats were seen, trouble often followed, whether spoiled food or plague. Rats became signs along the road, as meaningful as mile markers. Markets along pilgrim routes were infested too. Vendors sold food in open baskets, easily accessible to vermin at night. Pilgrims purchased bread already chewed, fruit already gnawed. Complaints of vermin in roadside markets appear in guild records, but fines could not undo the damage. The path to salvation was lined not only with shrines but with whiskers. Even elite travellers carried rats with them. Nobles moving with large entourages hauled wagons of provisions, tents and tapestries. These luxuries drew vermin as surely as peasant carts. In one account from the 14th century France, a noble procession lost significant stores of flour to rats, despite guards watching over supplies. Titles and banners meant nothing to incisors. The rat travelled with king and peasant alike. Archaeology again confirms the story. In the refuse pits of medieval inns, rat bones appear frequently, often with gnaw marks on food waste. In wagon remains recovered from waterlogged sites, teeth marks show how sacks were compromised mid-journey. Even coins bear occasional gnaw marks, carried in leather purses that tempted rats along roads. The archaeological record preserves your itineraries better than maps. The humour comes from inevitability. Imagine a pilgrim clutching a holy relic, praying for safe travels, while rats quietly chew through the bread meant to sustain him. Imagine a merchant calculating profits on spices while whiskers scatter peppercorns across a wagon floor. Human journeys were planned with care, but rat journeys required no planning at all. You simply climbed aboard and let wheels roll. The spread of rats through travel reshaped Europe. Species native to Asia moved westward through trade, displacing or mingling with local populations. Black rats, Rattus rattus, became dominant in much of Europe during the Middle Ages, carried by carts and ships alike. Their rise was tied not to deliberate introduction, but to accidental migration. Humanity moved goods, rats moved themselves, and so you became the universal passenger. Roads, inns, pilgrim hostels, noble caravans, merchant carts, all carried you as faithfully as any traveller. No toll was ever paid, no passport ever stamped. The highways of the medieval world were paved with whiskers as much as hooves. From the endless dust of roads, your story leads naturally into the hearth of homes again. Not kitchens this time, but the medicine chests and apothecaries, where humans believed they found cures. For even in jars of herbs and flasks of wine meant to heal, rats gnawed a place for themselves. So there you have it. You began as a whiskered shadow in the rafters, and ended up as medicine in someone's broth. You invaded fields, kitchens, markets, crypts and beds, and still managed to walk away with a reputation for surviving just about everything. You didn't just outwit cats, traps and priests. You outlasted famines, wars, plagues, and even medieval doctors, which frankly deserves some kind of medal, though I'm not sure where you'd pin it on the fur. And the next time you hear a squeak in the dark, remember, it's not just a rat. It's the unpaid roommate of history. the little archivist of grain, cloth, and bones. The creature that has been editing humanity's story with its teeth for 1,000 years. If you enjoyed gnawing your way through this tale of whiskers and woe, I'd love if you tapped the like button or subscribed. It helps more than you know, and it keeps this channel squeaking along. And hey, drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. I promise I won't send a colony of rats your way. Now close your eyes, settle back into the quiet, and let the scratching fade into nothing. Because tonight you're not just drifting off to sleep, you're drifting off with a rat in the rafters, and somehow it survived worse than you ever will. Good night.